us tonight. And we have an agenda we need to approve, first of all.
Yep.
Can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
Second.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to go ahead?
Since we've approved the agenda, let me just mention something on behalf of Amy and myself. As we come to this presentation, I remember the last time that we had such a presentation, we went for over 2 hours or more. So we talked with Mr. Yates, and he has assured us that his amount of time that he feels like could get through his 17 pages of presentation would be 30 minutes. That's just him, and I thank you. Thank you for reminding me, which I hadn't forgotten, but for sure. And certainly we want to maybe on the other end have questions to 30 minutes as well. So if we could get at least shooting toward our goal of an hour for the presentation and discussion to follow. We also said it was appropriate, we thought, as we looked at this together, that we would at each page, if we have any questions or comments, to address it at that time, not wait till the whole presentation is over, then have to refer back to the special pages that we were calling into discussion. So that if we can have an agreement on that, can we have an agreement on that? Okay, I don't see anybody shaking their head. I don't think I need a
We don't need an actual vote.
we don't need a vote on that.
It'll be a gentleman's agreement.
In a minute.
Okay, the next thing on the agenda is to approve the minutes. The minutes were sent out in draft form earlier today. Does anyone have any comments or questions about the minutes? Yes, sir.
I've got a question about the minutes on page, what page is that? Page 7 in the middle. Where it states, there's an understanding of the conversion. The only way to fund the PAYGO for the community, the CCEP, is by bonds. Isn't PAYGO and bonds, aren't they mutually exclusive? Is that a typo or?
I will defer to Jeff. PAYGO is not bonds.
I think that the discussion was, if you take the word PAYGO out to fund the community construction equity plan, and I think that's the part, we were talking about the construction part in that conversation, and that would be funded by bonds. So that would make sense that that's the part we're talking about. But yes, if you have PAYGO and bonds are kind of, it's one or the other, it's not both.
So if we change it to say, instead of the PAYGO, the project schedule, would that be more clear?
I think if you go ahead. You got your mic on. I think if you say, the only way to fund the community construction equity plan is by bonds, that would resolve the issue.
That's really,
The construction portion.
there's two pieces, they both work together. The PAYGO piece was looking at the 8 years, $20 million per year. The bond was looking at the brick and mortar, the larger brick and mortar expansions, additions, and renovations.
So would you say, Mike, it's fair to call it that, to just say that the construction portion of the community, of the CCP, is the part we were talking about in relationship to bonds?
I would make sure I put the larger
Okay.
brick and mortar.
They're talking.
Well, may I make a
Additions,
suggestion?
expansions,
Since the clerk who took the minutes is not here, maybe we shouldn't approve the minutes this evening and have her go back and listen to the tape, and then at our next meeting, we could approve the minutes. That way, we're not making it up as we go along.
I'm okay with that.
Okay. Okay, do we need a formal motion on
Yeah, why
that?
don't we have a motion on that?
I make a motion that we have our minutes reviewed by the clerk and brought back to us at our next meeting for approval at that time.
Page
7, about halfway down.
second paragraph.
Okay.
And
Okay.
was there a second to that?
Who took
Okay,
minutes last time? Was it Lynn?
Lynn.
Okay, I was thinking it was not, okay, so Lynn, yeah. So
Lynn
there you
did.
go, it's page 7 halfway down.
And it
Okay.
was seconded by Ms. Randy. Okay, so we'll put that off there. All right. Why don't we now go ahead and move to the presentation? And the clock will begin running. No.
I can go quickly, but I don't know if that serves us well to go quickly. So
And you even have a stopwatch, so.
a big clock. I think we need to get some of those in our shop. So, good evening, members of the committee, those folks watching at home. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the work. I think we had some in our last meeting. Remember, we asked for questions. We had a few questions come in, so I'm going to address some of those, and then I want to talk a little bit about some of the work Mike and I have been doing and working through, looking at the long-term capital plan and those things. So, with that in mind, and as I've been directed, we're going to try to keep this as quick as possible. So, tonight we're going to talk about understanding a little bit about county funding. We had some questions come in about taxes and where they go, understanding the allocation, the impact of reval. If you obviously everyone lives in Union County, so we just went through a reval process. We're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm answering a couple of those questions. Review the current board direction concerning debt. Review just in passing the legislation, and then talk about the project list and possible modifications, which is where kind of Mike and I spent the bulk of our work, which I think has been very fruitful. So with that in mind, property taxes in Union County, when you look at the total net county revenue, what we're talking about is about 60% of the revenue to the county comes through ad valorem tax. And ad valorem taxes pretty much are your property taxes. So the taxes you pay if you own a business on business, personal equipment, your cars, and your house, that represents the bulk of the revenue to the county. And this is the total across the entire county. So when we talk about, and I like to use my laser pointer, but I think these screens eat my laser. When we talk about property taxes, we're referring to the taxes charged at the ad valorem level for the volunteer fire departments, as well as the county operations and the school's tax rate. The other revenues you have, we have some leases, investment income. The enterprise charges for services, that's $37 million, about 12% of the total budget is from the water utility. The non-enterprise charges for services are from the things like Cane Creek, other types of fee-for-use services, libraries. Big chunk of that is related to our permitting and planning. Intergovernmental revenue, about $32 million. That's money we receive mostly for our human services, which is social services, health department, those kinds of things. Other taxes, about $3 million, and then in total in sales taxes. And the question we had was, kind of where does schools fall into that equation? And when you start looking at the total funding for schools, if you remember, we talked about this is the total net revenue for the entire county. When you start talking about school funding, we take out the pieces related to the enterprise funds and those other pieces, and you really look at what is now the school's budgetary fund and the general fund put together to kind of give you what of the general tax dollars or what of our general dollars go to schools funding. About 45% go to the county functions. About 16% of that funding, about $45.3 million, goes to school debt, and the remainder, about 108.3, almost 108.4, goes to current expense and goes to capital for the schools on a pay-go basis. And remembering in the school debt would be any of the bond stuff. And this is all based on 2015's adopted budget. We haven't, obviously we don't have 2016 in hand yet to be able to show. But this is one of the questions is where does the funding go, or how much of the funding the county receives goes to schools?
Right. Hey, Jeff, just
Yes,
for
sir.
clarification though, for people that are watching and people that may not know, that is, as we look at that percentage, it is only of the ad valorem taxes. It's not, the schools don't get a percentage of the sales tax and all the other stuff.
This would actually be the general fund and the school's budgetary fund. So the 108.3 or 108.4 down the lower
Right.
right-hand corner, that is all tax dollars. The rest of it, the school debt, about 30 million of that, and I'll show that slide in just a second. About $30 million of the school debt is sales taxes. Of the 124 million, that's all other county functions. That's that intergovernmental revenue for human services. That's the fee for the non-enterprise charges for services kind of things. And I think if you look at this slide, which I know for everyone in the audience is hard to see, and I hope everybody has a copy.
I'm sorry, can we just back up just
Sure.
one second? I think the question that Richard was asking that I am still trying to figure out is that we're talking about the 108 million, right?
It's two components. That's why I wanted to show you this, because this breaks down the general fund for the county. So if you go, it is 2 slides in from where that pie chart is. What you would see is that the debt service of the $45 million, $30 million of that is covered through the sales tax. The bulk of the other revenues come through intergovernmental revenues and those other things. So they go to those other different departments. And this is what we refer to as our kind of our net takers table, which shows the departments and how the tax rate breaks out by department. So for instance, you see in this calculation, the sheriff's department, it's just shy of 10 cents. Schools debt, even with the $30 million of sales taxes credited to schools debt, is about 5 cents. Emergency services, which includes your VFDs and your EMS contract, is about 5 cents. General county government, which is the catch-all for everything, kind of gets the benefit of a lot of general revenues. Administrative services, that's the back house operations and those kinds of things. But this is kind of one of the questions we had when we went through our budget process last year, is kind of how the tax rate gets allocated otherwise. And this is how it gets allocated in the general fund. Keeping in mind that on this, when you're looking at the 108,376, that is all property taxes. The remainder of the school debt is a mix, and the remaining 124,6 is a mix.
So when we're talking about the task of this committee, which is future funding, plan sources, et cetera, and so forth, we're relying solely on ad valorem, this 108
Right.
million. Is that?
Right. And I think that the question on this probably is more related to the concept. I think a lot of times what has happened, I think we may have got a little afield in some of our conversation related to the county's fund balance policy, our capital projects, and those other kinds of things, and kind of lost sight of where we needed to be as far as focused in on the capital program and kind of what those capital needs are. So we wanted to kind of just put this, remind you or show you this, because this was one of the questions we had asked of us to kind of show this slide.
Yeah, but just for clarification, it was just of that 108, as we were looking at that, that's all ad valorem taxes. It's not.
Absolutely.
So
Of the 108, the $20 million that Dr. Webb and I are
Yeah.
talking about, that is all ad valorem pay-go.
Cool.
So
Thank you.
with that, real quick breakdown of the 2015 tax rates, just so you can see that what makes up the total ad valorem across the county. You have 2 general county-wide tax rates, the schools tax rate at $45.50, and the general county operations. These will change because of reval, and I'm getting ready to talk about that in just a second. But then you also have fire districts, so depending upon where you live in the county, your tax rate is a little bit all over the place from a county perspective. And if you live in a municipality, it could be different as well. Is that, you have a question? Okay. So with that in mind, we went through a revaluation process, we call it reval. And what, is there a question? Okay,
Okay, so we skipped that other page.
which
Yeah.
page did that skip?
Well, there, that page there.
The county general operations.
Yeah, this is just the breakdown. We were asked kind of how the tax rate breaks out. So going back of that 45.50, and I wish my pointer worked because it'd be easier if it did. Of that school tax rate, the 45.50, that was the portion, that's the $108 million that you saw on this table right here. In the
I'm sorry, the 4550 is 108, that's
$108 million, 108.3, that's the 45.5. Okay. And then of the 3064, okay, of the 3064, approximately 12.4 million, almost 12.5 million of that is also of that 3064. So A portion of that 45.3 million for school debt comes out of ad valorem as well, and sales taxes. And that's what that table tells us. So,
That's what this general operations,
and I apologize if I can get over here behind you guys. The way to read this is, as these are tax rates. So this is, each of these tax rates tells us what each of these functions uses as far as ad valorem tax. So if you follow school debt and facilities charges across, the total budget for that piece was 45.3 million. Of that, current ad valorem taxes were 12.5 million. Also funded local option sales tax of 30.1 million, and then lottery proceeds of 2.8 million. So when you add that back across, that gives you that $45.3 million. So not all of the school debt's paid out of ad valorem.
Yeah, the school signs over the lottery money that they get
Yeah.
every year.
Right. So this gives essentially what that calculation does is it gives the schools the full credit for all the lottery proceeds plus all the sales tax proceeds.
okay, but going forward, we're only talking about the 108 million.
Right. Going forward, where we're focused, and where we're focused is that 108,376, because that's two components. That's the current expense fund, and that is the capital funds. Okay. Does that kind of make sense? Go past that. Okay. So the reval is a concept. At a maximum or at least every 8 years, the county has to revalue your property, and everyone should have received a notice from the tax assessor's office telling you what your new values are on your home. So what we do is we go through, and this focuses on real property because your vehicles and your business personal property are valued annually. And it's done with the intent of bringing the tax value on a house or the tax value on property more in line with what the market value is. And I think that that's an interesting, I'll show you in a second, an interesting graph. But the reval process really focuses on truing up the home values, because you don't do it annually, of taking and truing up the home values against what the real market value is for the purposes of taxes. And that trigger then is at least every 8 years, or if the sales ratio gets out of whack by plus or minus 15%. And the sales ratio essentially is a comparison of what the county values a house at or property at against what its actual sales value is. And they do that through taking a sample of actual sales. So let's say if your house is valued at $100,000 on the county tax rolls, but you sell your house at or if you sell your house at 85,000, your 85% of the value. That would be a trigger. So it's top end 115, low end 85%. And what happens then is that triggers within 3 years of that, the county has to do a appraisal of all of the real property in the county. And that's the process we just came through. And the reason it's important from a reval perspective is that kind of tells us, when we go back and we start talking about these ad valorem taxes, as you mentioned, what makes up that 108, the value of the tax rate that makes up that 108 has to change based on the value of the property. For instance, in 2015, the value of a penny on the tax rate was about $2.38 million. Going into 2016, that value is about $2.3,304,000. So we lost about $76,000 on the penny value. And you can see on this sales ratio graph that historically the navy blue boxes at the bottom of this graph represent the year before a reval. So that's how far out of whack, if you will, or out of balance these sales ratios were against the taxable value. And normally what you would see is the navy blue is on the low side. So the sales are higher than the tax value. And then the county would adjust its tax rates and its values to true up and bring the rate down and values up. So you see that occurred over the last, from 1986 to 2014, it occurred a total of 4 times. And that rate creeps up, and then it comes close to 100% and then kind of winds its way through. But what you would see then when you get to right around 2008, 2009 timeframe, that ratio flipped to the other side of that equation. And when you're at, I don't want to step away from the mic because I know people are listening. When you reach that sales ratio that is above 100%, what that means is the county is taxing your property. Go back to a $100,000 house. The county is taxing your property at the $100,000, even though it may only be worth on the market basis $85,000. So what happened in that case, and this was unique and really one of the first times, to my knowledge, around North Carolina this kind of occurred on a mass basis, the property values actually had to decline to adjust back to the real market. And it's a conundrum because the cost of government, the cost of schools didn't change because the value of the houses went up or down. And normally what the commission would end up doing is adjusting that rate downward because the penny value at that point is worth more. Well, this worked in converse this year. When we did the reval, the penny value went down, so the pennies have to go up to even generate the same amount of revenue and provide the same level of service. So a couple of interesting notes about the county. We're largely...
I'm sorry, so can I just kind of simplify this? So what you're saying is you're going to have to raise the ad valorem tax in order to bring yourself neutral.
Right. So for instance...
Or we have a smaller pot of money.
Or a small, that 45.5, the 45 cents in this case, that's the school's tax rate. If the rate stays the same, it generates less revenue.
Mhm.
That's the most simple way to say it. But yeah.
It's interesting that term true up, you could say true up, true down.
Right.
So,
And the legislation, the intent, and this is, we had a lot of discussion around with our commission about this. The theory behind the process is so that as the taxpayer gets the value of the growth over time. So normally what you would get the opportunity to do is that penny, instead of going like we did, we went back $76,000 per penny. You would normally creep up $50,000 or $100,000 per penny, which means that 45.5 would yield a lot more revenue. So you could roll that rate back or do something different. And you wouldn't have, you could give the taxpayer the break, you could have additional revenue, you could do something in the middle. In this case, just to maintain the same level of services and the same level of revenue, we're in we're kind of stuck in the position of having to raise the rate just to keep the bill the same on the taxpayer. And I think there's a lot, we have a white paper on our website about that. And it's really a much deeper dive into it. And I know I'm probably kind of rushing through it, but
Well, for the purposes of this group, are we going to have the same pot of money with which to make long-term funding decisions, or is it going to be smaller?
hold that thought because I'll get to that. But I think toward the end, I can answer that question. So can you hold on to that just until the end?
Okay, I don't know, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, it seems like it's a simple answer, but that's.
It is,
okay.
but I want to answer it in context with the rest of a part of the other discussion. So when you're talking about then the sales ratio in the county and kind of the property taxes and where they all come from, what we have is about 84% of our parcels in our county are residential. So that's about 80,000 residential parcels, exempt in other parcels, which includes churches and those different things. We have about 7%, agricultural parcels about 5%, and then commercial and industrial. So what we see is really we're a heavy residential tax base versus those other areas and those businesses. The results of the reval this year, and I apologize to the commissioners because I think the presentation I did for you a week ago left off the Village of Lake Park. So that was my fault. On a countywide basis, we saw a decline in value, taxable value on real property of about 4.64%. That's across the entire county. Every municipality was impacted differently. So as you can see, Hemby Bridge, I think, is the highest in loss at almost 11.5%. And Lake Park ended up gaining the most at just under 2%, and everything in between. So, and again, this excludes motor vehicles and personal property. And that's just kind of how it played out. So that means going back to the discussion of what's the tax yield on tax rates and so forth. We have a smaller pot, 19.9 billion to play with, or just under the 20 billion versus almost 21 billion. What that means on the regular or on the normal taxpayer in the residential, 69% of residents lost about 5.5%, somewhere right around 5.5% or more That's the median change. 31% did see an increase. So not everybody in the county lost value. Commercial, about 45% increased, 55% decreased. The average change was about 2.3% loss. Industrial, 65% decrease, 35% increase. And the average median change there was about a loss of 6%. Where we did see is a real loss in value. And this is value, not necessarily what they're taxed at, because a lot of the ag land is in a different program. But the agricultural land in the county lost a lot of value, going 91% had a decrease. And in that 91%, the average was about 30% of the value. So all that to say that the revenue landscape changed through the year and through the reval. So 16 is a different revenue year than what we've had in the past. And the question was, if you have a $100 million bond, for every $100 million on bonds, what does that cost as far as tax rate? It's about 4 to 5 cents, not knowing what the interest rate would be and those kinds of things. So it's going to be somewhere between that 4 to 5 cent range.
And that's true, Jeff, only if we don't consider any other sources of revenue, right?
If you borrow money, if you go to a GO bond, that is, that's what it would take to pay it.
Based upon only using ad valorem as opposed to other sources?
There's not, short of cutting operations on either the current expense fund or on the county side, there's not another source. In the commission's policy at this point is any new debt, particularly GO debt, is attached to a tax rate, which is kind of how we got to where we were with not having an ongoing source for funding for capitals, because the tax rates weren't attached to the debt. So under the policies we have in place, the ad valorem is the funding source to go with that, the ad valorem tax rate.
Right. But there are other funding sources. So the commissioners have made a choice that to fund this, it's ad valorem. The other revenue sources are not part of this pie.
Right.
Jeff, let me just clarify, and I just want to make sure I'm hearing correctly. What about as far as general obligation bonds that may be issued for schools? How would the lottery proceeds affect the retirement of that? The impact of sales tax and, say, debt retirement as you pay off debt? I mean, how does that factor in?
The way that works right now is the total lottery proceeds, about 2.8 million, are used for existing debt. They're allocated to that purpose. So that's going to pay part of that outstanding $350 million in debt we have. All of the sales taxes are going to pay the debt down. There's a portion of that that's dedicated to schools debt, and by policy, the commission in their budget has kind of allocated the remainder of the sales tax to debt. And what occurred to cover that debt service was there were layoffs, and the county reduced its cost and cut services. So as that debt pays down every year, that $1 million or whatever that number is being used to restore those services back from whence they came. So in this case, and that was kind of the trouble or the challenge that was run into. And then when the 8.2 cents, and that's kind of how we arrived at the 8.2 cents, or where the $19.5 million number comes from as a funding mechanism, is we looked back over all the debt that was issued going back to, I think the high point was 2007, where there was about 225 million issued, and said, okay, if the commission at that time had raised the tax rate to cover debt service, what would that tax rate, or what should that tax rate have been? It equated to 8.2 cents, which when you convert 8.2 cents to cash or monetize it to funding, that becomes $19.5 million. So that capacity that you're talking about when the pay down, that what capacity would have been there was pushed out through that 8.2 cents to PAYGO. So it's kind of the benefit of any of that savings has already been taken through that additional tax rate. So there's not really capacity that comes off as it's paid down.
Okay, and I'm just wanting to make sure that I'm clear and moving forward as far as brick and mortar and general obligation bonds. Ad valorem is what you're saying is the sole resource that we can call upon. There is no latitude in any other.
There's not at this point. I'm already 5.5 cents or 5.25 cents of the ad valorem pays the differential between the sales tax, lottery proceeds, on the existing debt. So, and again, going back, the county has very little control over the vast majority of those revenues. So really, we are at ad valorem as the only one the commission has the ability to raise or lower because of all those other revenues are tied to federal programs or, kind of like, Dr. Ellis has multiple funds, state funds, federal funds. Those things have to be used for what they're given to the county for. In this case, so ad valorem is kind of what, when you shake it all out the bottom, ad valorem is what you're left with. That's at the discretion of the commission.
So just to be clear, at some time prior commission, instead of raising taxes, what they did was cut other services that the county provided.
Right. So what happened, and I think the schools were frozen in that 1 year. If I remember the graph is about 79 million over 2 years, kind of held flat. The county cut about 80 or 90 positions, plus made some other reductions because the county used some variable rate debt instruments and some different debt instruments to try to build schools as they were coming on. And that worked well in a low interest rate environment. But then in 2008-9 timeframe, when those rates started to change and the market changed and your counterparties for swaps changed and everything, you had a spike in the cost of that. And when that spike came, the bill came due and that bill had to be paid. And what the county did at that time is they cut out 88 positions out of the organization and cut the services to pay that bill. And I think the schools at the same time shared a little bit of that and kind of froze where they were at that same time. So it was a tough time in the county as it was around the entire state, entire country in 2008-9. And everybody did what they had to do to be sure that the debt's paid because that's your first call on your revenue and moving forward. So going forward, what we don't want to do is have that happen again where we haven't put tax rate in place to be able to cover that debt and ensure that any bond program is funded adequately so that it doesn't impact services, either on the school side or on the county side.
So we're really ignoring any other avenues of revenue, right? We're just solely looking at ad valorem.
Well, if you look at this table, for instance, all of those revenues are tied in various ways to the services they provide. So for instance, if you were looking at, let's just take, for instance, the sheriff's office. The $2.1 million or $2.2 million in intergovernmental revenue that's in the sheriff's department is contracts with other municipalities to provide law enforcement services in that municipality. So that 2.2 million funds deputies in Indian Trail, I believe it's Lake Park, a couple of other places, and I can't remember all. Wesley Chapel, so they've asked for additional police coverage. So that's a 90% funded deputy in those places. If you look at, for instance, then growth management, the $3.2 million in revenue, $3.3 million in revenue in growth management, that's permitting fees. And based on the court decisions, the permitting fees have to approximate the cost of providing that service. So you can't really redirect those revenues. And by doing this analysis, what we find out is then there's not a lot of discretionary movement of those revenues. And when you look at the only thing the Board of County Commissioners controls as a funding mechanism is they set that tax rate annually. They're capped on sales tax. These intergovernmental revenues, 31 million, almost $32 million are intergovernmental revenues, which are dedicated to specific services. The charges for service come for funding those specific services. So we can't raise, for instance, the entry fee at Cane Creek Park sufficient to cover debt for schools. So when you're really talking through this aspect of it, you're kind of left with what revenue can you change, what revenue can you increase? And ad valorem is the thing that you can increase and change.
And by adding that 8 cents to, or the 8 point, whatever it was to, in this year's, you've really eased that for the county, true? I mean, so the
we use that for the
sales,
schools because that 8.2 cents
yeah.
went completely to the
I
schools.
understand, but you're saying the local option sales tax that's used to pay off some of these things over time, that's going to ease that. Is that true? Because you've raised the tax rate in to what it should have been previously.
No, not in this case, because the 8.2 cents is part of that $108 million, not part of the 45. So the 19.7 million or 19.5 million for Pago Capital, which we'll talk in a few minutes about as well.
I understand that, but what I'm saying is that you added the 8.2, and so over time, that will relieve the sales tax that you have to use to pay off the debt, true?
No, the 8.2 is not at all going to debt.
Okay.
So
Jeff, I hate to belabor it, just so I'm clear in my mind, as far as our debt capacity and how much of that we leverage and how much we retire, say with sales tax or lottery tax, over time, as we basically build equity in our investment and the debt ratio comes down as to what our capacity is and what our mortgage is, so to speak, would that not free up sales tax or some lottery proceeds to help offset? I mean, just looking at it like in the term of a home mortgage or something.
right, only to the point where in probably 2025, 2030 time frame, where it gets to where it bottoms out below the sales tax level. At that point, there's probably a little bit of room for discussion.
I'm sorry, that was the point that I was trying to
Okay.
make. If you raise the overall pot, at some point, you're going to ease the burden
Right.
on
And-
whatever's being used.
And that's more a function of just like in your house, you know, if you use a 15-year mortgage and you think of bonds as a bunch of whole lot of little mortgages, not one big one. So every year you're retiring a portion. So when we get to 5-10 years out from now, we start to see that significant drawdown because you're getting 20 years away from your first tranches, and they're 20-year bonds. So all the construction that went on in 2000 pays off in 2020, or all the construction that went on in 2007 pays off in 2027. So you do start to see that drawdown, but only on the back end in the 2022, 23, 25 timeframe. Does that help? So when we go through, look at reval, and the question came up is how do we estimate property taxes? Based on the general statutes, and I have this section here for you, the county is required to estimate based on collection rates and what our last collection rate is out of our CAFR. So when you go to our CAFR, I believe it's Schedule 11, you can look at what our property tax collection rate is and our motor vehicle tax collection rates. And you can see in 2010, we had about 90%, 91% on motor vehicles and about 97.6%. And the way that works then is we have to say, we're estimating the next year's value, that penny value we talked about. We can say we're going to tax at 100%, but you're only going to collect 98. So the revenue we estimate can only reflect 98% collection, such that if, let's say we were going to get $100 million from taxes based on the levy, we bill for $100 million, we're going to collect $98 million. And as you can see, there's been some growth in that. Our tax collection office has done a good job, plus the economy's picked up. So you've seen some growth going from 97.6, 98.1, 98.4, 98.8, 98.9. I would argue 98.9, 99% is pretty unsustainable in the long run. The motor vehicle tax collection, going back to 14, if you remember, if you've renewed your car recently, for the first time you had to pay your tax bill to get your tags. Well, surprisingly enough, that has generated more collection because people can't get their tags without paying their taxes. Before you could get your tags without having to pay your taxes. So we've seen that jump up. And when we talked last time about the overage in revenue, the $6 million overage in revenue, it was because of the overhang and the increased collections that we weren't allowed to, based on general statutes, to estimate more than 93% collection or 92.8. But we knew based on the motor vehicle tax, there was going to be a change to that. And all that matters because when you do the calculation to figure out how much tax revenue you get, you go through the process, you get down to total real and personal taxes. That revenue will be collected based on our 16 estimate at about 98.6%. And that's derived from what our tax collection office thinks it can collect. And then the 1.9 billion in motor vehicle tax is going to be collected at about 97%. And you see that's close. We think the 2014 year was a little bit of an anomaly in the motor vehicle tax because of the change in the collection method. It spiked upward. We think it's going to come back down just a little bit. So
So Jeff, are we, in the past, we've underestimated?
We've
Is that-
estimated in accordance with the general statute. And what you see then is when, for instance, if I can step away for just a second, I hate doing this, I apologize. What you would see is in 2011, we had to estimate 97.6% based on the general statute for collections of real property. What we actually collected was 98.1. So the collection rate, that 0.5% became additional revenue above estimated. Okay? And in the bifurcated process, and the reason why this matters in this discussion is in the bifurcated process, because we have a school's tax rate broke out and a county tax rate broke out, that 0.5% share is 60-40 split on the total tax rate with schools. So whatever that 45.5 in this case for 2015, we had to use the same rules for estimating it. But if we best our collection rate, the equivalent of the 45.5 overage goes to the pot that funds the capital program and funds current expense. Just like the 30.64 piece goes to the general fund side. Because we bifurcated the tax rate, so any benefit going forward based on that collection gets split in accordance with the tax pieces, which I think is one of the concerns that the Board of Education shared in the past. So this is a case then where everyone benefits proportionally on tax rate from a higher collection rate than anticipated. But I do think that, 98.9 is pretty high. I think when we talked to Van Harrell, who's our collections manager at the county, we're in the top part of the state when it comes to collections. So I don't think it's sustainable over the long run. But in the way we've built the budget now, that funding that comes in over a proportional part that goes with the tax rate can become available with appropriation, obviously, but can become available to help fund additional capital in those other pieces. We won't know that until October, November, what the actual outcome is until after the audit. But once the audit's done and that number's known, then that money then becomes available through the school's budgetary fund to be applied to either schools or to be used next year as part of the funding calculation, those kinds of things.
May I ask a question?
Absolutely.
When you said it can be available, is that upon 3 votes for it to become available, or is that part of it that it is going to be available?
It takes appropriation of the
know.
commission. It's accounted for separately. It's like every dollar has to be appropriated. So even when we collect revenue on behalf of someone like the VFDs, we can only pay them up to the appropriation level under the general statutes 159. So to make that money available once it's known, then the commission can amend the budget and add that back to the total calculation. I'll tell you, I know on property tax, real property tax, we hit our collection estimates 2 weeks ago, which is about right. This is the time of the year we've collected about 99.5% of our collections because everybody pays their property taxes in about 3 or 4 months of the year. We're not quite there on motor vehicle, but we think we will get there. But the benefit to the schools in this case, because it's a bifurcated process, is that money doesn't go back to the big pot. That money goes to the schools fund, and then the commission can decide at that point what to do with it.
So you're saying that for this year also? I mean, because
For 2015. You can't appropriate it right now
Well,
because we don't know what that is. But in November, once the audit comes out, and this is a long conversation we had during our budget process last year in the bifurcated process, is because we split it out and we have told the taxpayers 45.5 is your school's tax rate. Therefore, 45.5 of whatever taxes are paid should go to schools.
Got it.
So I don't think there's any discussion or any intent on the county's part to do anything other than that with that tax other than schools.
Cool.
And I
Thank
guess I have a question because, so you get to whatever your threshold is, and for every dollar you collect above that, 45.5 goes into the school fund, 30.64 into the general operating.
Right.
And then it's up to the commissioners to decide that that money can actually be spent in those categories?
Yes. Just like the schools the 19.7 million, or 19.5 million for capital for this year, that had to be appropriated.
And
I can't give the schools a dime
is it
without appropriation from the commission.
generally what the commissioners do is say that money goes to school and that money goes to operating?
This is our first year of the bifurcated process, so we don't have a history. We've never done this before.
Okay, is that what your intent? I mean, that's what would
that
make
is our
sense to
intent.
me.
That is our intent.
Why would you do anything other than that?
Well, I just said, that is our intent.
Are we talking just by practice, we have to go for a vote to appropriate it to the schools, is that what we're saying?
Not by
And that-
practice,
that
by
just-
law.
That is
By law.
completely reverse to logical thinking to me.
Okay,
Well, because if you collect revenues,
okay.
and this is how you've chosen, or this is the formula for breaking it up, for every dollar that comes in, regardless if it's at your collection rate, above your collection rate, below your collection rate, I'm not understanding why the vote has to come in and why we
Because-
have to get ourselves into a conversation on a regular basis about how it's split up.
And under General Statute 159, not a single dollar can be spent without the appropriation from the Board of County Commissioners, regardless of the policy of that.
Okay?
Okay, so what has to occur, and this occurs during the budget during the May timeframe, the current expense money that the schools get from the county, the capital money that the schools get from the county are done based on appropriation by the Board of County Commissioners. All that process is then, if that estimation is over during the close of the books, then it's just a continuation, it's an amendment to that appropriation level for them to add that back. I'm not legally authorized, and Dan's under the same constraints under Chapter 115, that I'm not legally authorized to write a check that the board hasn't approved.
So when you get to your final true up, your final bottom line, is it then the school's function to go to the commissioners and say, we've got $15 over, we'd like to spend it?
I think it'll be
or-
discussion between, it probably will start at the staff level if I had to guess. As Cindy mentioned, we haven't done it before this way. So this will be our close of our first year. I can tell you how I anticipate it to go. I imagine we'll have some conversation. I'm sure the board chairs will have some conversation about it.
Jeff, I think last year, the true-up was in the neighborhood of $700,000.
And the 13-14 year, when
So
we
it's
had
not
a
the
policy in
first
place to
time
do it, there was a true
We've
up.
done this. And then
Right.
additionally, this is applicable to basically all departments.
Yeah.
Volunteer fire departments, they fall into the same rules.
Absolutely.
It's not unique to the schools.
Mhm.
This is a state statute that we must follow.
Okay.
And this process should go through.
So essentially, it's the true up without calling it the true up.
Right, and we built that back in,
Yeah.
knowing that we didn't have, for 14, for that year, we didn't have that policy in place. So this last close, there wasn't that piece, but once we did the bifurcated process and set the tax rates the way we did, based on the expectation and the moral obligation, I believe, to the taxpayer, by calling it the schools tax, it has to go to schools. Now, when we did the $760,000 true up in the fall of 13,
That wasn't fabricated.
that wasn't the bifurcated process, but that money was agreed upon, and I believe it was used for salaries, if I remember, non-certified salaries. And that was something that Dr. Ellis, we said, this is what the true up would be. We talked to Dr. Ellis's office. They said, well, this is how we'd like to see that true up used. The commission said, yes, that's the case. We'll appropriate the money for that true up. Took three, it was a 5-0 vote.
So it'll generally be considered as part of the overall funding for the schools?
It can be,
That
but it's
true up
not
part.
known until,
Okay.
you can't appropriate it now in this part of the year. You have to
Thank you.
wait till November to do it because the
Let
books
me
aren't
ask
closed.
a clarifying question, make sure I'm understanding it. What I'm getting out of this is that
I'm
the
I'm
commission.
sorry, Reverend. I know I'm out of time.
This isn't a theological term, bifurcated.
Bifurcated.
We need, so we won't talk about,
64 or whatever.
so it's the split of the dollar.
Can you just
The
call it
split of the
split?
dollars.
Because
I think it was something about a sword and a baby. They were going to buy it for oh,
It's
Are
a
you
terrible
really
story,
calling
terrible
Tommy?
story. No, I'm sorry. Yeah.
But, and Jeff,
Go ahead.
I wasn't talking.
You never.
I'm sorry.
No, what I was going to say was, my understanding is that the commission in the budget assigns dollars, like a dollar amount. So that's why you can't just do it based on percentages. So they can't just assign it and say, here's your 45% of whatever we collect. That's not how they do it. And the statute says, if you get more dollars, you then must assign out those dollars.
You have the opportunity. You don't have to, but you have the opportunity. The commission may appropriate additional funds through the year. You're exactly right. The budget has to be balanced to the dollar. So it's
Not percentages.
it's not percentages. So we have to put a dollar value to that estimate and an expenditure value to that estimate, and it has to be exactly the same. So, and I think we spent a little bit of time on it. It sounds like a lot more difficult process than it normally is. I don't think we have any issue. When we had the last true up, we had no issues coming to agreement what the true up value was and what the use of it was. Is that? This is true. So that's kind of answering those questions concerning that. If you want to, I think I went through the calculation. So kind of where's our current board direction given to us?
Jeff, before we go, I want to make sure that I'm clear, and it may help some folks that don't have a real clear picture, and I think I'll defer to Dan, but it's just like construction contracts. We legally cannot enter a contract until we have money allocated for that purpose. And to address the uncertainty that I'm hearing from some folks here, would this be something that the budget ordinance could address as far as the intention of these funds? I mean, can you encumber it or at least indicate,
It's
just out of curiosity for
The statement-
long range planning and that sort of thing? Is
our
there a way
budget
to
ordinance
address
already
that?
states it. It says that this is for schools purposes, that this portion of the tax rate should be used for schools purposes. Our CAFR sets that aside, although it's a general fund. There will be a page in our CAFR this year at the close of the 2015 year. That's the school's budgetary fund. So it is as transparent as I can make it, and it's as locked down as I can get it. Because I think that the boards, this board can't bind a future board. And that's just kind of the way it is. But the intent of the board when they set that process up was that whatever money was collected through the schools tax would be spent on schools.
Well,
And we've done everything we can to show that, to make that obvious and transparent to everyone watching and everyone reading our financial statements.
Yeah, and I just wanted to echo what Chairman Helms offered. I mean, this is something that, like I say, from the facility standpoint, I'm very familiar with. It's not unique just to the process of allocation of school funds or whatever. We deal with it every day, so it's not really a unique concept as far as how we're looking at dealing with funding for capital needs.
Okay, so moving on kind of from that discussion, where we are with our current policy and kind of the current concerns related to debt from the commission and why we kind of go back to why ad valorem is our commission's current policy and direction to us is no non-voter approved debt. That means all the different flavors of debt that are out there. And the reason why is when in the 2000s, as we went through and we used all those various tools, based on even in 2014 or the latest numbers we have, the county's debt per capita as a percentage of the household income, we're the 6th highest in the state. The percentage of assessed value is the 3rd highest. Our debt per capita load is the 2nd highest, and these are all in counties over 100,000, so 26 of the 100 counties. 19% of our general fund goes to fund debt, which is 3rd highest. So the commission's taken it as a serious charge that as we move forward, the voters really need to have a say in that additional debt load put on, or that stress put on the county or the taxpayer. So that means that, for instance, the issue on 2/3 bonds is those kind of circumvent the voter approval process. COs or COPs or limited obligation bonds circumvent that voter process. So the voter wouldn't have a say then in getting back to these high levels of debt for a county. So that kind of leaves us with GO being the tool. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But based on the direction and that philosophical belief from our board that all debt, new debt brought into the county should be approved by the voter, then that kind of gives you narrows down your range of tools. It's not a legal narrowing. It's a philosophical narrowing of the board and their policy or their direction to staff. The other direction we've been given is we're going to follow the legislation concerning PAYGO. And as Mike, I think, fairly pointed out, the legislation says funding of at least $19.8 million. Mike and I have been working on it. We feel like we can be right around that $20 million mark, that 19.7, and make it work. So really then you're left with two funding issues. You have the PAYGO funding piece. Again, the plan to be 19.7 million, 19.8, and then voter approved general obligation bonds. And that process is a collaborative process between the school board and the Board of Education to determine the amount of that. Kind of bringing us full circle then.
Jeff, how much, just a question, how much debt capacity in terms of dollars do you think the Union County has?
Debt capacity is kind of a sticky question because it's not, there's a legal capacity, which is over $1 billion, but there's an affordability factor, which kind of goes back to this debt per capita median household income. We wouldn't like to be in the top 5 or top 6 or second in any of these categories. And even when you blow it out to 100 counties, we're in the top 10 in all of these categories. So these are indicators of stress that your debt puts on your community. And as long as we're in this upper echelon of that, we feel like that debt is stressing the taxpayer, if you will. That a large portion of their tax bill goes to debt.
So can I go back to my question that you deferred until later, which is, can we anticipate the 108 million being a smaller pot because of reval, or?
So based on the legislation this year, which having the legislation in place kind of trumps your calculation on reval. So you flip the calculation on its ear, if you will, and you say, how much do I have to charge based on the current value to get to the dollar value or the dollar figures laid out in the legislation? So where that $19.7 million would have been 8.2 cents, that now is probably like 9.5 cents in that range. So based on, which is why I think the legislation is positive in this case, is it gives us a dollar amount to set the rate at to provide what we've worked through as being the funding, kind of the long-term funding plan. And I think that kind of the where are we kind of answers your question. So in our meetings with Mike, and I'll let Mike talk about his schedule in just a second, is we have $20 million in ongoing maintenance need. That's the non-construction, non-major construction part of your CCEP. We feel like that we've come to material kind of agreement that 20 million is the number over the life of that. There needs to be flexibility in that process because needs change. Now, Mike and I differ on opinion in some ways on what projects should be prioritized in that, but I don't have enough information, nor is it my job to run schools capital. So we've also agreed that the soft costs in those major brick and mortar expansion and renovation projects will be part of that $20 million cost. So then that leads you to the other piece that kind of we've worked through is that a GO bond referendum is the tool for those big brick and mortar expansion projects. The timing will be determined by the two boards. As we talked about, the first opportunity for bonds will be February of 2016. You have February, May, November. So that's not necessarily something that has to be decided tonight because we have about 90 days before that election that you need to tell the Board of Elections. The detailed list of the projects will be determined by the two boards from that perspective, because I think when the McKibben report comes out, Mike's going to look at how that relates to his project schedule, and if it changes, your project schedule and that project package may move up and back and around.
It has to be agile.
So it has to be flexible to address that. So I know Mike wants to talk about his construction schedule.
Before Dr. Webb steps up there, I do have a point or a question while Mr. Yates is still there. And it goes back to the current board direction. And correct me if I'm wrong, but this is sort of a recurring thought. What's our debt capacity in the county? How much can we borrow? What's it going to cost? What's it going to do to property taxes? And I think this is somewhat illuminating, because it's, as someone who's been in the debt capital markets in the past, if I saw somebody who's pushing their debt limits, if they're the highest in all the categories, that would raise concerns. So what I'm assuming at this point, and I'd like for you to speak to this, is our debt rating agencies are advising or requiring that we keep additional, as a county, keep additional liquidity set aside for emergencies, because our ability to borrow that is maybe constrained at this point, since we're already in the top levels of borrowing. And if we do borrow, the cost could go up. You said 4 to 5 cents for the first 100 million, second 100 million, maybe 5 to 6 cents, and then anything additional over that would increase substantially, correct?
The way that the rating agencies have commented on, and all three of them have commented on this issue, is they're concerned because we have a high debt load on an affordability perspective, because there is a legal debt margin, a legal limit. Even if we went up to that, then it would be completely unaffordable.
But their issue is also not as much the debt load, but it's also the type of debt we got.
We have corrected the vast majority of their concern over their variable rate debt. That's mostly been fixed over the last year. The biggest chunk they're concerned about are the two parts is the liquidity, which is why we have the reserve policies we do, and the affordability to the taxpayer, because there does come a point where you put so much debt load on your taxpayer that you're taxing yourself through debt out of an affordable range for people to live in your county.
And then thus impacting the growth on future taxpayers to help shoulder that burden as well.
And that's their concern, and they've all stated that in their most even recent rating reports.
And what is our current rating?
We are, we have a split rating. We're AA plus AA across the three rating agencies.
And have they given you any guidance as far as what threshold that rating changes?
No, they've told us what their concerns are, and as we address their concerns as far as liquidity, variable rate portfolio, taking care of different components of that, then we talk to them and talk about where we are. So, for instance, right now we have a stable outlook, which is a positive, So they said for the foreseeable future, all else being equal, your rating is going to remain the same. When you borrow large chunks of money, though, that could have an impact.
It could have an impact. We're not at excellent, but we're at very, very good.
We're at very, very good. I mean, obviously, the highest, you want to trade at a higher credit because you can borrow, your borrowing
cheaper.
power becomes higher.
Right.
You don't want to fall, because the further you go down that chain, you're spending more money on interest and less money on projects. And I prefer to send as much money go to projects as I can versus bondholders. So it's a mix of things in the ratings scales. A lot of these factors, because that's where we pulled this list from, is from our rating factors. They are concerned, and they express their concern in just about all of our ratings reports.
Right.
So but we're resolving a lot of these issues.
Well, and to be clear, I mean, if we had an excellent credit rating, they would still share concerns.
This will keep you from getting to AAA.
I understand.
So, and if we took on, let's say we took on $300 million in debt, you run a substantial risk of being dropped a grade or two, which then, depending upon the differential in the trade, how the ratings are trading that day, when you issue the debt, could be anywhere from 50 basis points to 100 basis points, just depending on what the spread is.
But that's a possibility, but we could also we could continue another year down the road, pay off more of the debt, continue to deal with the issues
heals.
they've got, and we could go borrow $300 million and our credit rating wouldn't move at all.
I doubt that.
Well, I think you'd have to wait a little longer than a year to get to that point. But as your debt portfolio matures and as you kind of start to buy down, these numbers, you start to sink down this list. And as you sink down the list, they get more comfortable with you going back out to the market. What they don't want to see you is pushed up to the edge of affordability and risk not being able to repay your bonds because you have stressed your taxpayer to the point where they can't afford it. So it's kind of a balance.
Right, which is kind of where I was getting with this. Instead of asking what is our debt capacity and what can we borrow, we're in several categories ranked pretty high, which I would say poor as far as debt load on the individual taxpayer. So the question I think maybe is more pertinent is, what is our debt service capacity at this point, especially based on the individual taxpayer and affordability and maintaining the growth that the county needs and wants so much, and growth in schools and everything. So, I mean, there is a balance there. And I'm a little cautious to just lever up, because I know and I've seen that, you know, if you take a couple hits in your ratings, it gets unaffordable very quickly.
And I think that that's why the board is, and I don't want to speak for them, but my interpretation of what we talked about with the board is that's why they're so adamant about voter approved debt, because if we're going to go down that road, the voters need to decide that and have the opportunity to decide that for themselves versus exercising some non-voter approved debt tools, because we're right at the top end of that process.
Well, and I don't think anybody in this room or on the Board of Education, the county commissioners, or the taxpayers would disagree with that. I do think, though, that Robert's right, that, you know, it's about a capacity for what we can pay. But as we look at trying to fulfill our task, how are we going to pay for, you know, this 8-year plan? Sometimes I think lay people hear the sky is falling. If we do this, then this. Well, correct. But if we're also a year, 2 years, or 3 years down the road, 2016, when we do this, by the time it goes through and all of that, our debt will be in a different place. But if the only thing they're hearing is, well, goodness gracious, if we do a GO bond and we bring on $300 million in debt, our debt rate will fall and we may have to pay more money for that debt. But another year down the road, 2 years down the road, our debt rating may not fall because we've done a good job. You've done a good job. The commissioners have done a good job. And our debt rating stays the same or potentially moves up. So all of these variables are there. It's not just that it could potentially drop.
It's a complicated process. So there's a lot of pieces to it. But I think that's why we kind of agreed in working through this list that there's the $20 million piece, and getting to the maintenance needs and those pieces under the $20 million is kind of key. And that's the ongoing cash funded portion. That cash funded portion has no impact on the debt piece. And then the big bond pieces is kind of, we've talked about, the GO is the tool. The timing of that is yet to be determined. But whatever that ultimate list has to be, the tool to get there is through the GO, through the voter approved piece. And that's kind of where we've been working around that concept, Mike and I and Dan, and trying to get there. And I think and for the most part, we're in agreement on these components. And he's looked at his schedule, so I don't want to steal most of his time. And Reverend, I'm sorry, I'm way over my time. I know.
Our hour's up.
Well,
I shared my time with him.
Mike, before we
You
move
yielded.
on, and I want to clarify this and recognizing and respecting what the commissioners are saying about general obligation bonds. I can appreciate their position, given what we've had to endure in correcting pre-existing conditions. I think as a school system, we have bought some breathing room to allow us to prepare and respond to future needs. And as far as general obligation bonds are concerned, I think it's tantamount that we clearly articulate the needs, justify the needs. And I think both as the Board of Education and the Board of County Commissioners, it'll be important that we support these efforts as far as getting these bonds passed, because, you know, we've bought theoretically 5 to 7 years of breathing room with the equity and seats that we have within the school system. But if we don't put something in place in the form of a general obligation bond, you know, coming out of the ground and getting complete with brick and mortars, 2 to 3 year process. So if we don't start planning now and we don't get behind the bond and use this tool that you guys have identified as our best vehicle to get where we need to be, I mean, what is going to be plan B? I mean, I think it's very important that we recognize if we don't address this properly and a mutual effort that, you know, 5 to 7 years from now, we could find ourselves in a position where we have to go back and look at 2/3 bonds, or where we have to leverage COPS and resort to things maybe that the taxpayers wouldn't be as palatable to. So I'm hoping that the two boards recognize this is a good tool. Like I say, I recognize and respect what the sentiment of the Board of Commissioners are on this thing, but I just think it's very important for this group as well as our collective boards to recognize of how this thing needs to unfold and the importance of supporting the general obligation bonds.
And may I say something?
Yes, sir.
Kind of address that? The key here is the taxpayers. And as Jeff equated, the Board of Commissioners, we had a list of bond items that were brought before us too. And we decided as a board that in a reval year, this is not the time to do that. So, you know, we're telling our own constituents that, yeah, the libraries, the, you know, ag arenas, the arenas for things like that, the timing is just not right. And yes, you agree. You know, I can speak for myself, but the 2/3 bonds, that is taxation without representation to take that money from our citizens again. I'm just telling you that's why I'm taking that stance personally, and I'm just one vote. But it's important for everybody to understand every penny we spend this year in the budget cycle comes out of your pocketbooks. It's not money that we have, and so therefore we take it very serious that this money's coming. And I heard a comment earlier, somebody said 45%. I thought I heard them say. That 45.5, that is the number of pennies of the ad valorem tax.
I believe I said 45 cents.
Okay, it's for, well, I'm just clarifying it. That is
But
out of
if it
the
was me,
70,
that's what I said,
76
45 cents.
cents, 45 cents of the ad valorem tax is what has been allocated for schools. So we're taking very serious your concerns with your growth and everything like that. But, you know, we have to be consistent. We have to be conscious of the impact. And then you keep referring to voter approval. Voter approval is actually approving an additional ad valorem tax. I mean, it's a direct relationship. So we've got to be conscious of it. And we understand your concerns, and we want to work with you. I am ecstatic at the working relationships we're having now, and I want to continue that. I thank you.
Well, and as a group, if we're putting together a long-term plan, we put the GOs in there as the long-term plan for if we have to build brick and mortar. That's what you're saying.
No, I'm saying, no, I'm not talking about the GOs. As far as I'm concerned, that's all. GOs are off the table. If you need to do brick and mortar, you need to do bond referendums.
I think that's what Amelie means is that. if we're
I'm
gonna
sorry,
do brick
he
and
called them
mortar,
GOs.
They're GO bonds, they're voted GO bonds.
Okay, yeah,
Oh.
yeah, fine. I'm sorry, I was thinking
That's okay.
2/3.
That's okay.
I think Amelie's
No,
referring to-
But I was
no, I
just
didn't mean
saying-
to give you a heart attack.
No, I was just saying, so that really is our long-term plan,
Yeah.
is to work together.
That's true. And that's why I am so excited about this 14-member board, because we sit down eye to eye and we discuss, and we have learned a lot about the way you have to budget. And I know that Commissioner Rushian went to a class the other day that shared some more information. And there's one coming up the 30th that I'm looking at because I do want to know, because we've got to do the right thing for our citizens.
Okay. Mike, why don't you go ahead and at this point, make your presentation.
Sure. Good evening,
Minutes,
and
Sam.
just a few things to share with you. Again, phenomenal. Commissioner Helms, Chairman Helms, I do agree with this. It's been great sitting down and working with Jeff and his staff and Dan and I. What I want to do is go back. You tasked us, this group, for Jeff and I and Dan to work together to come back with a recommendation for you all. And then what this committee does with that, will be up to the group of you. So what I'm here to tell you is that working together, where we are is what the staffs are recommending. We're recommending that we put that out to the voters for a bond, Commissioner Helms, Chairman Helms. When Jeff talked about it could be at least the 19.7, the staffs have agreed that over the 8 years, the $20 million will get us to our needs
It will help us meet the needs that were identified by the stakeholders, the community members that served on those site-based teams, the teams of teachers, the administrators, the facilities department, our facilities committee that vetted through those tens of hundreds of projects to sift and filter them down to those 850 identified needs on that one leg of our CCEP. And that's been carved up over an 8-year period. Please keep in mind that these two plans must work together. Jeff and I and Dan agree to the figure of the $20 million, and we use that as a round number. I know that it's 19.7 this year, it's 20 and some change, or 21 one year, but we can make that work. What we also agree to is the flexibility, because what I shared with the Facilities Committee and the Board of Education is our plan to be a true living document must be agile, because we've contracted with McKibben to drill down at the micro level within that crescent of growth that you hear us talk about, that whole 485 corridor from the Cupperson area over through the Porter Ridge area. Well, we see that now. Well, what if it heats up in a different area that we didn't see, or what if it's starting to change? It's very fluid and it moves. We want to make sure that we are solid when it comes to utilizing the taxpayers' dollars, because I'm one of those taxpayers. So what I'm saying is, if our plan's not agile and we're not utilizing the data we have, then we're not maximizing the dollars that we're gracious to get. So when we had that flexibility, when the staffs agreed to the flexibility, it allowed us to look at the construction calendar. Remember, I shared with this group that we wanted to start with some soft cost early in April, okay? You ask us to go back and look, what can we do differently? Working together, and this, let me preface this. This document that you're seeing here, this construction calendar draft for major brick and mortar additions, renovations, and replacements, this has not been vetted and approved through the Facilities Committee and therefore the Board of Education. So it must go through that before it can replace the one which the Board of Education, which they have approved. What we did is looked at the calendar, worked with Mr. Hughes, architect, and our staff, and said, what can we do? How can we align this? Once we had flexibility, we pushed back those early projects. If you look there, the 6 top projects, starting with Newtown Elementary School and going down through Porter Ridge High School. We will start those soft costs in July, utilizing the funds from the approximately $20 million that we have for the fiscal year 2015-16. You heard me say earlier that the staffs agree that we place this group of projects on a bond referendum for the public to decide. And therefore, you see construction not taking place until April of 2016. So we have adjusted the calendar, and we were able to do that with the staffs working together and the county affording us some flexibility. We would start looking with the soft cost, as I shared with you in July. As you work down that entire list, the brick and mortar additions, repairs and renovations, the final move in would be September of 2019. We would have completed all of the projects. Correct, I'm sorry, it is October 19. I looked at the last one.
And Mike, you're expecting the McKibben report to come back in November, December?
McKibben report we should have that November, December shared with the board. And again, based on the information that we have, we will adjust and adapt the plan as we need to.
Well, and I think, Mike, you might want to again, touch base in case someone's forgot, but part of the McKibben study this time, we will ask for the micro focus on growth pockets as well as the general trend. So maybe it'll correspond to these specific locations a little tighter.
Well, I think to Amelie's point, and what Mike and I talked about is, because we don't have to call that bond election or have to go through that decision-making process until that point, we can have the McKibben report in hand to support that and that flexibility. And this is where Mike and I talked about the agility of the plan has to address whatever comes out of the McKibben report. So as much as this group is good from that perspective, that's a little bit outside the time frame of where we're at. So, and the discussion is when that McKibben report comes back, I think then this list gets reviewed in light of the McKibben report. And then from that list then becomes, if the Board of Education wants to make the request to the Board of County Commissioners for a bond election based on that and those data points, then I think that's the process. We don't have to jump the gun to decide what this list is exactly and what that bond election looks like exactly today, because we have some time. There's not a time pressure in that, because we can't put it out for election anyway. Even if the Board of Education wanted it, there's not an opportunity until next year to do that.
And how long, I've never been through that process, how long is the bond process take?
It takes about 4 months to 90 days to get it on the ballot.
In our discussions, we felt we needed at least to allow Jeff's team 120 days.
So getting the McKibben report in November, December
Correct.
puts us in a good place.
Yes.
Yeah, in either a February or May timeframe. And that's your opportunity. And talking with Mike, even if you went to a May election,
Does
that
not
doesn't necessarily
change
impact
our calendar.
Well, and Commissioner Helms, from what you were saying earlier about no capital on the county side, would the county be behind bonds if the McKibben report sussed out that this construction was needed? I mean, I don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm just trying to put two and two together here to say, is this making sense?
It's making sense, and I have some question too, because I'm looking at this geography, this part of the county, and I assume McKibben's going to take into consideration there's a proposed 1,000 students of charter schools coming into that
So there are several variables that
Yeah.
he will take into account.
But he
That's
will
correct.
take into consideration that, because that would make a difference whether or not,
Mhm.
I mean, because you're starting, I guess the design phase, if, for example, one of those was impacted sufficiently that you said that's not the smart thing to do, could that design be used at another facility?
We've done it before.
We were planning to build an elementary school on the grounds of Cuthbertson Middle and High School.
Mhm.
Mike.
We were planning to build, or the school system was planning to build an elementary school on the grounds of Cuthbertson Middle and High. And we saw the shift over what is now Poplin. And so the building went there and just took the blueprint and had to make some minor adjustments, and were able to do that. So yes, that has been in previous times by
Well,
the
that's
school
good.
system.
Correct.
That's good, because, that way you're not wasting those funds going into design, and because I know that 300's already been approved and another 600 are coming. Yeah, Indian Trail.
Correct.
So-
Yes.
And Chairman Helms, that's one of those early projects, those first 6 projects.
Mhm.
Those are really looking at not where it's sustained growth.
Okay.
So we know that that's there. We don't, we hear the terms bubble. We don't really discuss the bubble in our facilities department, because the bubbles, it's, for our planning purposes, it's really gone. It's in the high schools. It'll be 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th next year. So we look at what's the new growth patterns. Is it pocketed growth? Is it flash growth? Or is there another bubble developing? And if so, will it be as big as the one that went through? It helps us in our long-term planning. And that's what we try to look at over a period of time.
And I know there's a lot of change, because I spoke with one of the towns and they're talking about 600 houses in that. I mean, there's growth. So I'm looking forward to hearing what McKibben says with the new environment.
And specifically, I guess we'll ask McKibben about, because I think you all, Jeff had brought up aging in place in some
I'm sorry,
communities.
I did not-
Aging in place in some communities versus
Correct.
turnover
Where
from?
typically the pattern had been when, children would graduate, that the parents would sell the home and relocate. Is that changing, I think is the question.
And that'll be a question that McKibben will be able to give us some reasonable answer that we can all agree on.
One of the biggest driving factors is truly your birth rate, your in-migration versus in comparing your out-migration as they go through. I continually look at schools. I looked at Newtown Elementary today. I looked at the kindergarten registration, okay? They had 90 children that had registered for kindergarten, and I think they've got another 20 packets out, so 110. Well, you have 110 potential kindergartens next year, and you have over 200 fifth graders going out.
Mhm.
And your current sitting kindergarten class is 127. And you have to watch that and make sure, what is that? What, again, is your growth, is it consistent? We're seeing, okay, if that 20 is there, you're 110, 115, and you're 127. So you're starting to see a pattern, and you track that at your elementary level and see if you're getting a pattern to begin to develop.
Well, so not everything would be addressed by McKibben and the growth patterns because not all of these are additions to capacity. Isn't that what we talked about last time?
Some of them will be to bring seats. For example, Newtown is not adding to the core, it's bringing the seating capacity up to the core capacity.
So, I mean, talking about putting these in order for the bond referendum and the right time to do that, is this in a declining tax economy? Is this the right time to do that? We already have the capacity at some of these schools. We're just adding seating. We're making it 1,000 seats when it is 1,000 seats.
We're not adding, if a school, for example, if a school's capacity currently sits at 870, and I'm just pulling that number out, 870, and we see that it's not going to get to 870 unless they have a large number of mobile units there. We're not doing anything to that school because there would not be a need to. That's why if you look at the plan, and remember last time I shared with you what you could break this down and it would show you exactly what was going to be done at each one of those schools. The school, even though the middle school the board set it at 1,600 kids, we looked at the growth pattern and it's not going to exceed 1,400. So we're only building it to 1,400. We're not going to put tax dollars out there in brick and mortar for it to sit empty.
And you'll only build it to 1,400 if you see those 1,400
That's
coming.
correct.
But I'm saying we already have 1,000 kids there. Why are we doing anything right now? We already have the kids there. They're in the mobile units. I don't understand why we have to build.
Well, again, the direction from the Board of Education was to address the needs. And again, I think that will be for when you go to look at the bond. If you notice, we recommended that the two committees, the Board of County Commissioners and the Board of Education, work together to identify what they're going to place on the bond referendum.
Well, and I think the macro focus on some of these growth pockets will shed, good light on that. And we're not talking about an immediacy right here as far as seats and capacity. I mean, I'm frankly looking 5 to 6 years down the road. And, the employment pool around Charlotte, be it professional or even laborers or technically acclimated folks, the labor pool is very slim right now. There are a lot of people that are being recruited to move here. And like I say, we're seeing the trends escalate as far as new dirt construction, both on single family homes as well as multifamily. So I think if we just look at the immediate need without taking the micro and the whole picture as well as the macro that McKibben's going to provide, I think we're going to be short-sighted. I mean,
I understand what you're saying, and I think that's probably what McKibben's being hired to address. My point is, if Newtown already has 1,000 kids and they're already there now, why are we building onto it starting now?
What you're doing, Ms. Bernard, if I may, mobile units were never meant to be permanent to replace the brick and
I
mortar.
agree, but I'm saying why now?
It is to buy time.
The
I'll use that
urgency
term.
of it is what I'm asking. We're in a declining tax state. We don't have the money right now. I'm just saying, is that something that can be put off?
That would be something that the Board of Education
Go ahead.
and then their priorities, just like the Board of County Commissioners have their priorities. And it's something certainly the board could consider, but that is what the Board of Education
So you're
put
saying,
forward.
as far as our advisory group, we're not discussing anything like that?
I
This
think-
advisory group, if I remember the statute, was not the lit, it was not to identify the list, it was to identify
It's
the
not to
funding.
identify the list, it's to identify where it falls in the list. I think that is within our scope.
I think what.
Well, I
To get us
respectfully
back on
disagree.
target, I think what you asked Jeff and I to do is to bring a recommendation to this group on how to address the funding. What we have brought to you is that we are in agreement for $20 million approximately per year for the next 8 years. We are in agreement that a general obligation bond, and that will be a determination of the voters of Union County. We are in agreement that the two boards sit down at a time that would probably be sometime in the early to mid-fall to make sure that we give plenty of time for Jeff's team to put the referendum together. And at that time, it would be those two committees or two boards sitting down to determine what's going on the bond referendum. And I think that's what you asked Jeff and I to do. And I believe that we have accomplished that for you. And I appreciate, Jeff, the working with you over the past several weeks, and look forward to our meeting next week as well.
May I?
Yeah.
For the first time in a long time, and I've been working with Union County Public Schools for 36 years, this is the most peaceful relationship or the best time we've had, the two boards. And I'm not a member of either board, but I work for the Board of Education. And I greatly appreciate the effort put forth in working together. And I truly mean that. Mr. Helps, it's quite refreshing you came over for our art walk, and never before have I seen that kind of cooperation. And I think that bodes well for both boards. I know that you and Mr. Collins have a good working relationship, and I think staffs have really worked well together on this. And I'm greatly encouraged and greatly appreciative because this too is my home. And I'm very much, and Mr. Collins is not on here, but wherever you are, Mr. Collins, listening, I think that on behalf of both boards, and I just need to say that.
And I appreciate that. And John and I have had numerous conversations. We've agreed to disagree respectfully, but we do the dialogue and understanding each other's your needs and our capabilities. I think it's going to take us a long way. I think the $20 million, Jeff and I have had this conversations a number of times. I mean, the dialogue, and I'm hearing from both sides how well the two of y'all are working together. And I think we all appreciate that. But as long as we continue to talk, and we're not going to always agree, but we can, and Mary, I committed to this to you before I was on the board. We can disagree respectfully. And hopefully we'll come out with what's the best for our community. But as long as, when we stop talking, things are going to go back like they were. So that's why I'm so excited about this board, this opportunity to sit here and have this dialogue. So, yeah, I look forward to our continued working relationship. And I know our board is pleased that we're moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. Helms. Thank you, Mary. Any other discussion?
Amy's question. The second point of the recommendation on the bond referendum is not that this is the exact project package or all these pieces are what's being recommended. You not hear me? I'm sorry. But in our discussions, what we've had is that once we have some more data in hand, this list will be evaluated in light of the data and kind of those decisions on moving out of portables to full brick and mortar, where the growth is occurring, where the micro growth is occurring. Those are conversations that yet to be had. This isn't a recommendation from either staff I know Mike's done a lot of work on this, but it's not a final decision that this is the package to be put on a bond referendum. What it says is bond referendum is the way to do these types of projects. That specific project package will be determined by the two boards because there will be disagreement on that package on some level. I'd be kind of surprised if everybody just went yay and agreed on the list. So, but what we're hearing is that there's a willingness on both sides to work through that list together to get to what that bond referendum has to be. Whether it's 250 million, whether it's 150 million, there's working together to get to that. And I think that some of those questions you have about, they're very valid. Moving away from portables to brick and mortar, where the growth bubble is, where you should be adding versus permanent capacity versus temporary capacity. But I think those are discussions to be had in the process of developing the bond referendum if there is to be one at that point. But I think we don't have enough information at this point to make that decision.
So what you're saying is that we would talk about this, we just don't have enough information to talk about it now.
I really think you have to
And
have
so-
a refreshed McKibben report with a micro drill down to support some of the assumptions we're making. And I think that's kind of critical in that discussion.
That's what I was
But
trying to
at
get
that
at.
point in time, that would be between the two boards to make that decision.
Yeah,
The
'cause
working
I'm not
group would
sure-
not make the decision.
Where our working group is, well, we're an advisory group, so it's advisory nonetheless. We don't have any official mandate on this. We're not elected. But where do we go from here? Do we have another meeting? What's the next step?
I think the question is, do you agree with the recommendation that the staffs have put forward? And if so, supporting to both boards to move forward in planning to work together in a meeting to determine what perhaps would go on a bond referendum?
I think to Amy's point, I mean, we have come a long way from what I've seen, from stepping off the curb into this working group. I think we've come a long way, and I share everyone's sentiment that we've, that this has been a very positive experience. We can work together, we can disagree. And earlier with Mr. Yurchek, I was not saying no to bonds. I'm saying I've got some questions about what level and ratings, and I think those questions need to be answered before we commit to it. As far as recommendation, if the recommendation is to continue discussing, at what level do we fund the bonds? I think, are all these projects in play? Yeah, maybe. Do we do all these projects? I can't recommend that personally now because I haven't seen the updated report, the McKibben report, which I've got questions about. Will it include the charter schools and the impact of additional capacity? And we just need to know that. I'm not saying that any of these are wrong or bad or no. I would like, Jeff to find out from the rating agencies, get some sort of indication as well. Hypothetically, what will this debt load do to credit rating and impact and cost and everything? As far as, and that will maybe give some guidance as to how much we can afford, given the position, the per capita debt load that we have on the citizens, and what that debt load does to growth. And hopefully McKibben will address that too. Hey, if we knock it out of the park and the county, remains on fire growth-wise, sure, yeah, it makes sense. I think like Jeff said earlier, it's a complex, just the debt rating portion is a complex. There are a lot of factors involved. The growth, there are a lot of factors involved. I like where we've come. I think we need to continue having the conversation, and I'm glad to see the two boards communicating effectively.
Well,
So I recommend continued communication if that's, based on what the proposals are.
because we have a June 1st, June 30th deadline.
Right.
And we won't have
Get to
McKibben or
Raleigh.
any of that at that point, which, basically, this group is,
We have all the information we're going to have, I think, because the McKibben is not going to be finished until probably it'll be our December board meeting if it follows historical perspective. So, I hope this group does not disband, or a remnant, or the working group, whoever may or may not be on it. I would hope it would continue. Excuse me, but I'm not sure what else we're going to have to add to what you guys have already done, because you've hashed out the 20 million on PAYGO, and then that we need to wait and see what McKibben's got to say and have, and look at it like that. So
I think if the recommendation is, the 20 million in PAYGO, everybody's agreed with, and that we're waiting on the McKibben report to answer some questions, and that there'll be some version of this hashed out, and it will be funded by some form of general obligation, project-specific bonds voted on by the taxpayer, I could agree with and recommend as a proposal.
Mr. Dixon, I'm not sure, with McKibben's report, it'll be November, December by the time we have it to even provide to the Board of Education. At that time, if it's December, you're trying to, try to get a bond referendum ready starting January. I'm not sure that's doable. So I think absolutely we need to continue with the dialogue, but I think it's going to be incumbent upon the two boards to look at the list and determine, they've got to determine what remains on the list. Is it one bond? Is it two bonds? Again, if we wait until we have the information from McKibben, and that's December, with the holidays there in January, there is no way that I think they'll be able to get together and give the due diligence that this study needs and this request needs for Jeff and them to get a referendum ready.
And when did you say the dates were, Jeff, the months that the possibilities were next year?
It's really February, May, November. And I think we would be tight, but on a May, I think you could get it done right around that time frame. I don't think you'll have enough information to do a February. We don't know if it's going to be an early February, a late February, because again, it's based on what South Carolina does. So
I think it's the 28th maybe, because I looked at that trying to figure out, but that's still
But I think
too close.
it would be tight, and I think Mike's right. It's going to be really, really tight. But if we have the information and you guys meet the first part of December, then I think that we just have to hustle on the dialogue at that point. Because I really do think, and Mike and I have talked about this, I really do think having the best, latest data in hand for the conversation helps craft and prove out to the taxpayer the need for those projects. So while I think Mike's right, it's going to be a push and it's going to be, hardcore. The good news is it's not during the budget time necessarily. I know you guys are working on it, we're working on it, but it's not during the hardest push of the budget time. So, I think we can get there. It's going to be a push.
And we will have actual numbers for the charter schools then?
Yeah.
I mean, that would, we will know where the bodies are.
I just don't get in a situation where we go, yeah, let's go do it, but we don't have all the facts. And, kind of like some politicians who shall remain nameless that said, no, I haven't read it. Let's pass it and see what happens. I mean, that's my sole point there. And I think we can make the May deadline, as far as, I just think it's wise to have the latest, greatest information in
And
hand.
we had planned to do that, as Jeff had shared with you, and that's why we state, both of us, we have to have agility with the plan.
Absolutely.
Because
yeah.
those first 6 projects you'll be moving through and working on. But it's that next list based on the data that the two boards will have to work with.
Well, and Robert, to your point, I mean, we've come a long way, and bringing in outside stakeholders, community stakeholders, I think it was important to the process. And Dr. Ellis, are you saying that you don't think that this group needs to be involved in the next step? Or
I didn't say that at all.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay, that's what I was trying to make sure.
I'm listening, and what I'm hearing is that we have the PAYGO for the 8 years, the 20 million. There are no other funding resources within the county budget that we can shift around, high prioritize, low prioritize, whatever. All we really have is the bond. We got 6 of us that are community citizens that are trying to have our ear to the ground. I know you are. my buddy, my co-chair here, as am I. I'm just wondering if it would be any feasibility at all in us just helping to talk about where our community is. There's a strong opinion that in certain areas of the county that if we tried the bond, it would fail. due to some recent decisions that have been made. And I'm just thinking if there's any way at all we could do to bring healing and nurture in this process to help all of our residents see that if they don't vote for a bond, then what are the other options? I mean, where are we going to go? What are we going to look at? When a school gets to capacity, no one wants their kids moved out of the neighborhood. A lot of folks have had enough of that. I understand that. My granddaughter got moved from a school that she wanted to go to a new school. I understand the impact of that on the family. But at the same situation, is there no way we can be somehow productive and helping us as we move forward and we start thinking about even the bond? Amen.
Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, I move that we accept the staff's recommendation to adopt the concept as well as continue to evaluate and substantiate the general obligation bond concept for brick and mortar, with an understanding that process will be flexible and refined as we move forward in working towards a 2016 bond initiative.
Second. Who was the second? Richard. Okay.
All in favor?
All in favor, could you let your vote be known by the raising of your hand? Okay. Done. All right.
Mr. Chair, I think one of our challenges is the way I understand the statute, our challenge is to look at the long-range capital needs for the schools. I think with the PAYGO, if you look at the top 6 things, we could probably make that happen through the PAYGO, even if the GO bonds are turned down. But we also think not trying to be pessimistic, I'm just realistic maybe, but also we need to look at the what ifs, how we're going to go forth.
We're already having conversations about what ifs. I live in the real world, Mr.
Oh, I know,
Mills.
but I'm saying, but us as a group, we can contribute too, because I think one of the things we are blessed is we've got 6 community members here that bring a different perspective than we do from our relative positions. So I think the committee needs to proceed. Mr. Stewart's recommendation, we're moving forward, but I think we need to take it a step forward and start analyze that. Maybe our next meeting, we start looking at the what ifs a little bit. And, you can enlighten us with the information you have, and the county's going to have some information on what our capabilities, and we'll have those conversations.
So what do you propose?
Sir, I guess you're amending Mr. Stewart?
No, I'm just commenting to Mr. Stewart's. I mean, we approved Mr. Stewart's motion already.
Right,
So
that's
I
right.
guess I would ask, what is your time frame? Because we were talking about the McKibben reports, you're talking about the what if discussions.
Well, I think in a future meeting, and it's April now, and May we have a meeting and we'll have some more information, and what we have to present by the end of June, we can even add some more insight into what the recommendation of this committee is.
A July meeting?
July's past their deadline, but I'd like to see a July meeting, because I'd like to see it continue on, because I think it is good.
Mr. Helms, and this is maybe it's my ignorance. Could the 2 boards or the 2 board chairs or 2 boards, whatever, not determine they want to keep this way of communication with the community and the 2 boards alive and
think so.
continue some form?
Yes.
I think from staff standpoint, I feel like we have benefited greatly. I know I popped through going to Rotary Tuesday and I about ran all over Jeff and had no idea he was anywhere around. And it seemed good to know that there was communication rather than he said, she said, that kind of mess. So certainly I'm not an elected official, but I would greatly appreciate if the 2 boards would determine that they
Would like to continue.
After the June deadline, it would take
Yes.
both boards voting to continue this group.
I think it's helpful to
I
our
welcome the
staff.
opportunity to bring that motion before our board.
And Mr. Stewart, I'm looking at you because you're a sitting board member.
Well, I think if you'll reflect back first meeting, I said regardless of what happened statutorily. I would like to see this group continue. And my intent basically was to affirm the pay-go concept. These gentlemen have brought us here tonight with the understanding, as far as any bond, we're recognizing there's further refinement as far as data to be obtained, the flexibility we alluded to in the stack process, and then as we move forward. But conceptually, like I say, I recognize and respect the fact that the commissioners are choosing to pursue debt management through general obligation bonds. So basically, my motion was to endorse that concept and allow for the process to be identified conceptually to the commissioners to meet our statutorily mandated June 30 deadline, and then also to allow us a latitude to hopefully have this board reconstituted after the expiration date to continue the discussion and recommendations. That was my intent in my motion.
I'm not sure what there would be, unless, Mike, you have something that's going to happen in the next couple of months. From our perspective, I'm not going to have any additional information for the next 3 months that's going to change the discussion that Mike and I have. If, I know Mike and you guys are going through your budget process for the next 8 weeks. We're kind of pinned into our budget process. There's not going to be much more work done around this, except for the budget part of it, the process part. So, I think after the dust settles, if the two boards decide they want the group to continue, I think that's appropriate. I'm just saying, I know from my perspective, I won't have anything else to add to the discussion.
There's a lot to do.
As far as presentations or materials.
From the school standpoint, I won't have any new information until the 20-day.
And on top of that, there's this thing called closing out of school year, which contrary to popular belief doesn't poof happen. So I would hope we could at least get to the 1st of July for us.
Right.
I would just,
Push the button.
that on now, all right. My thought is, and based on what Jeff said and what Dr. Webb has said, I'm not sure that there's a reason to meet in the next 30 to 60 days. I would be of the opinion, let's wait until we get the McKibben study and look at those results. And then based on what we find there, and we would certainly have more information at that point that this group could digest.
And Dr. Webb, do you think that the 20-day numbers would be an initial reflection?
We won't get the 20-day, we won't know the 20-day
won't-
numbers by the
not on the
20th day.
20th day.
It takes
Yeah.
some time.
Power School in Raleigh has broken down repeatedly.
Yeah.
And it took us, I don't know, 27, 32, a while to
So
get
maybe on
them.
the 45th day or,
When we get them, we'll be glad to share them.
Yeah.
But we have to turn them in, and then they have to validate them.
but that would
Certify 'em.
be
So
an
back
initial
to, I
blush.
guess
that
my
if we-
question was, when is the McKibben study coming out?
I won't get that until probably, correct, November,
Okay.
December.
So I guess my thought is I would recommend that maybe the board get together after the first of the year, once we have all the information, can digest that.
Well,
And in the interim, Jeff and Mr. Webb or Dr. Webb could work together and continue to prepare for that. That's just my thought, so.
And Richard and I were just discussing, and I've had, and Chairman Collins is watching this. I received a note from him. So, and John and I have had conversations too, and I just leaned over and told Richard, one of the things that I like to have dialogue in, he's in favor of the new Sun Valley. I'm not. Let's have that dialogue. Let's go ahead and, those are the kind of dialogues we can have and gain information. Now, do we have to do it in the next 30 days? No. But, continuing on with that process, I think is very beneficial.
Well, I think it's going to help the taxpayers to understand too, that we're laying some of the groundwork for what's going to take place at both boards. And that it's not going to be new information to them. They will have heard a lot of this discussion here, and then it'll go back to the two boards to be vetted out. So I agree with Chairman Helms.
So is what you're proposing to have a meeting in the next couple months to talk about some specific
That's fine.
items?
It could be
specifically
July.
Sun Valley?
But I'd hate to see us go 6 months
Yeah.
and
I mean,
not have any dialogue and then
I'm
come up.
Open to that.
Yeah.
If there were specific items to discuss, what I think the worry was that if we were just rehashing the same thing, we need new information. But if we have specific items And obviously you two know a lot about this.
We'll put it in form of a motion then. So I make a motion while we're still a body that we convene again with an agenda to be determined by the board chairs in the end of July and have more dialogue. I put that in the form of a motion.
Do we have a second on that motion?
I second.
Okay, Mr. Helms?
All in favor?
All right, so then we would be looking at the middle to end of
We need to vote on
July.
it. We need to vote on this.
Oh, you want to do a formal vote?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
yeah, we better. Sorry.
Yeah, call for a vote.
Call for a vote. Raise your hand if you are in favor of a meeting sometime in July.
Late
Mid to
Late
late
July.
July. Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Everybody look at your vacation for sure.
Yeah, yeah, that's the only problem with July.
That's the only problem with
Yeah.
July.
Well, and I think in respect to our staffs, not only do they have to get a budget developed and get it adopted, but July 1, it's time to start ramping it up. So we need to afford them the opportunity to get on the ground and
Well,
running.
and July is the date. If staff determines that it's late July, 1st of August, I think that's fine. I think that'll be, but yeah, I think we need to get together, not wait 6 months. And
On a
continue
lighter note,
dialogue.
Dr. Webb, thank you very much for the larger size
Large
document. I
print.
appreciate it.
And Jeff, thanks for your patience
I'm
in
glad you think
handling
it's
all
large, Fred.
of our questions that we've had. Since this is our last meeting until we reconvene in July, I just wanted to say something. We set some ground rules back the first time we met. You remember well those ground rules: collaboration, mutual respect, candor, constructive discussion, shared responsibilities, no blame casting, no discussion ongoing of the appeal. Thank God we didn't bring that back up tonight. But nevertheless, we've honored each other and we have honored this process. And I know as one of the co-chairs, and Amy can speak for herself, I'm very proud of each and every one of you, very grateful each and every one of you for how we have worked and what's come out of our time spent together.
Yes. I think you're all just swell too. I cannot follow the Reverend's preach on that.
Amen. We got it. I hope and trust there's a divine influence somewhere. Let's do lunch one day. Huh?
Yeah.
You know where Crossroads is?
I know, we've been there a whole
I
bunch
think what we
of
ought to do is get Chris and you and your family and let Lisa and I come and meet you. I'd love for her to meet you. She's heard so much about you. So,
Or you could come to my house and shoot a person.
oh, she would love, she used to ride.
Okay.
I don't know where she would be in that now.
Right, I have.
Now, you showed me, or at least Kevin sent it to me. I'm not sure. There's no way I could get on it with my ruptured Achilles. I can't risk it.
I have a thoroughbred and an old